Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and the up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, it's incredibly dispiriting to find that I'm closing out this Black Film History Month with a negative review of this year's first prominent commercial film directed by not only a black filmmaker, but specifically a very promising black woman filmmaker who a few of you may know, one Nia DaCosta. I'm of course revealing that I finally got around to watching 28 years later The Bone Temple, not so much a sequel as a companion film to last year's 28 Years Later, which saw British indie veterans director Danny Boyle and writer Andrew Garland reuniting to craft what did turn out to be a stylistically audacious, imaginative legacy sequel to 28 Days Later, following its story of zombie cataclysm portrayed against the backdrop of the geopolitically quarantined United Kingdom to a speculative present day where the last shreds of human civilization continue to migrate, settle, and raise a new generation, all while continuing now almost neo-medieval wars against the infected, swarming hordes of mad killers who have contracted the so-called rage virus and threaten to spread it to anyone who comes into direct contact with their blood. I'm not going to waste air rehashing the plot of 28 Years Later. Quite frankly, the best thing about the film is that perhaps even more aggressively than the first film released over 20 years ago, is that you could really go into it blind and enjoy it as its own contemporary, speculative kind of fantasy movie, which, because it's primarily told through the eyes of a tween child, Spike, played by impeccable young actor Alfie Williams, who basically has to live out some kind of Alan Moore-esque, explicitly violent, atmospherically dour mutation of a YA fiction, or maybe even like a shonen manga, like Attack on Titan. But in a surprising twist for a follow-up that was shot basically back-to-back with the original film, Garland picking up immediately after the events of the first film, and DaCosta literally reusing most of the major set pieces and locations from the first film. The Bone Temple feels quite deliberately from the outset like it's taking the parenthetical structure of Boyle and Garland's film, which is framed by the introduction of a completely different child character named Jimmy, only for that character to be foreshadowed and then reappear as an adult, a clearly rather maddened and violent one whose intentions after rescuing Spike from the infected were sure to be terrible. But then just jumping into the Bone Temple in media res and making it clear, especially in how DaCosta and cinematographer Sean Bobbitt's visual presentation is completely different from Boyle's now iconic style of really blurring the lines between commercial film and music video and aggressive avant-garde distanciation that calls for the audience to remember that they are watching a movie, making its accentuated rather than hidden artificiality part of the experience, part of the atmosphere. In this new context, DaCosta directing Garland's ongoing story her own way, Spike goes very quickly from being the hero of his own bleak fantasy journey to then being taken under Jimmy's wing, joining his cult gang of satanic nomads who treat this zombie apocalypse as a bit of fun and old Nick's judgment falling on mankind. That also turns Spike into strictly part of an ensemble of a much more stripped-down, detached kind of low-budget action horror. And one that is told side by side with a convergent narrative about two more characters from the first film, the hermit Dr. Ian, played by Ralph Fiennes, and his increasingly unlikely companion, the huge so-called alpha infected, played by Chi Lewis Perry, dubbed Samson, whose seemingly unique capacity for learning might actually hold the hope for curing the infection. It would be one thing to call the Bone Temple restrained, but as DaCosta's wild career has taken her from her 2018 breakout indie neo-noir Little Woods to being knighted basically by then rising horror star Jordan Peele to co-write and direct his black-focused Candyman remake, to being one of the first black women to direct a major Hollywood fantasy picture in the form of Disney's The Marvels. Anyone can tell you that her own authorial imprint, the way she tends to shoot a film, though more usually one that she's had some part in conceiving and writing, she's not so much restrained as she is simply not an aggressive stylist. And if the Bone Temple feels restrained, it's only because that's how much of a world of difference there is between DaCosta's eye and Boyle's. By far, DaCosta's most stylish film was the one she made just before signing on to direct The Bone Temple, last year's shamefully under-remarked upon HEDDA starring Tessa Thompson. And even there, part of what becomes the fascinating mystique of DaCosta's writing and direction, her first opportunity to fully return to authoring a truly independent creative vision, is that she really only manages to pull off the high-wire act of making something that feels formally current while also being timeless in how her combining of snappy dialogue, moody Baroque color and lighting, as well as a much more gracefully fluid camera that describes environments and costumes as defining subjects just as much as the performances by the actors themselves to suggest a character. HEDDA is at once so unobtrusive in terms of how current it looks when compared to any number of better-than-average, mixed exhibition indie films of its kind in a world where film directors are far more often contemporaries and colleagues with a new generation of prestige TV directors who are more function over form, who do rely more on heightened dialogue than even a lot of contemporary commercial films do. But it also just has the feel of a classic Hollywood, even pre-code decadent melodrama. For DaCosta, whatever style the film takes is merely the idiom of its form, to make the obvious quote from Susan Sontag, whereas she tends to avoid stylization so that whatever style there is descriptive of the subject rather than the line Boyle treads so consistently in his career, the form coming to describe itself, the commercial film starting to literally take on the qualities of commercials and music videos, appropriating the act of selling you a product as a Warholian experiment in finding new, maximalist means of arousing us and teasing our emotions. The Bone Temple isn't just restrained compared to the first film, it's that it's practically the opposite instinct. This is a companion sequel to a legacy sequel that is kind of just shot like what it is, which is a cheap B-zombie movie with recycled sets. Talking about DaCosta's career arc, again, I'm frankly reminded of a September 19th, 2023 profile piece in Vanity Fair of her by Rebecca Ford, where in that article, as part of the interview, Ford describes DaCosta as still showing a kind of overt, lingering ambivalence in much of what she's quoted as saying during her time directing The Marvels, even at one point being quoted as saying that she knew her creative vision was taking a back seat to what was, in essence, a Kevin Feige production, and how, in premonition of all this paying off with HEDDA, she was finally quoted as saying, "It was really great to play in this world and to be a part of building this big world, but it made me just want to build my own world more." And yet here we find ourselves still at the outset of 2026, me doing what nobody asked or would ask me to do, which is try to do something special for Black History Month, try to do a Black Film History Month with a particular focus on current, working black artists, and I can't help but feel as though DaCosta is not only back to playing in someone else's world, literally using sets that were built for a different film, working from a script that Garland very clearly seemed to think that everything he had set up in 28 years later was so fascinating that, quite frankly, the journey of the story slows to a crawl, walking in circles around the same place where the last film left off. What's a word for that when talking about journeys and walking? Like if you cross the same ground a second time and very soon after you were already over it, like you tread something more than once. This is a production that is in many ways not only stripped down when compared to 28 years later, but in relative terms even stripped down to a degree that's even more sparing and more function over form oriented than DaCosta's debut feature. It's reminiscent of the sort of thing Roger Corman used to do to give his many movie school underlings opportunities to direct. Hey, we still have some sets up for another week, and I checked the paperwork, and Boris Karloff actually owes me 2 days, so go make a movie in 3. It's not as extreme a dip in production value as back in those old drive-in days, but the Bone Temple can't help but feel, especially in the wake of DaCosta finally returning to building her own worlds with HEDDA, and doing so with astonishing aplomb, like her most unique and still underexplored talents are just being hired out for the sake of a cheap exploitation picture. And anybody who's familiar with this channel knows that I'm the last person to quite mind a cheap exploitation flick. I honestly love them. But that's sort of the thing, again, that Roger Corman would give an undiscovered talent. I'm sure Nia DaCosta doesn't resent the paycheck and a stable career and the ability to work in these fantasy and franchise worlds she clearly loves anyway, but that what ended up being her cinematic return for most mainstream audiences, or even just fantasy and horror fans, those who hadn't and mostly still haven't seen Little Woods or even knew about HEDDA, that return is coded as if this now already rather firmly confidently established director who, just like Boyle and Garland before her, can move between ethos of commercial work for hire and her own bespoke authorial interests. That she still effectively presented to the wider public as an arrested XXL freshman and not a varsity senior just leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Because it's not even that DaCosta turns out to be ill-suited for the job. In fact, the best aspects of this otherwise doomed to failure tie-in movie, Boyle and Garland effectively producing an exploitation ripoff of their own film, is the ways in which DaCosta's less aggressive, more holistic and descriptive style really does get the most out of Garland's fantasy story in a way that Boyle would never even conceive of doing. When we're on the track with Jimmy and his roving band, DaCosta is able to conjure veritably neo-Western vibrations, especially when their party of outlaws happens upon a literal homesteader cottage in Irish countryside and subjects the inhabitants to savage, cruel games for their own sadistic pleasure. With this half of the material, DaCosta shows the greatest benefit of not directing the way Boyle would, echoing the way that an old master like John Carpenter would shoot not for the shot, but for whatever it was that gave the audience the fullest picture of the scene. How much of the story you can tell in just one or at most a few basic mid to wide angle shots that effectively block actors and ground us in a credible sense of environment, no matter how fantastical the subject matter. With the other half, the developing relationship between Dr. Ian and the Alpha Samson, she basically switches gears to an even older pedigree of B horror and science fiction, that being the very kinds of movies that, again, Roger Corman and his contemporaries produced in the late 50s to mid-60s, where they were atmospheric and filled with padded, highfalutin oratory out of necessity, with everything being held together by Ralph Fiennes basically assuming the Boris Karloff, or better yet, the Vincent Price part, drawing more upon B-movies in the sense of their crude adaptation of modern horror and sci-fi literature. There's especially this sense of this half of the Bone Temple echoing Richard Matheson's I Am Legend finds, basically spending the whole time narrating his own adventure, though thankfully in the form of a passionate intellectual conversation with the mute Samson, not just oppressive voiceover. In both cases, DaCosta makes the strongest case for not going for the most maximally stylistic shot, in not cutting too quickly and in simply allowing the camera to describe the weird and bizarre in ways that are effective and complementary without necessarily ever being picturesque or remarkable to look at as their own discrete angles and pieces all jumbled together in a schizophrenic puzzle as with Boyle. Even the incorporation of music is a stark departure from the earlier film, with DaCosta getting potentially just as much out of something as simple as watching Doc Ian dance with the drugged Samson to Ordinary World by Duran Duran amidst his eponymous ossuary, instead of a vulgar display of discordant sonic power that was the Young Father's soundtrack for 28 years later. This is really great stuff that's conveyed in a patient, observant way that even a lot of filmmakers, especially white male filmmakers working in this kind of new exploitation rubric, struggle to maintain because maybe they're too uncritically obsessed with exploitation films and a little too intent on recreating them that they never find what DaCosta does, which is just the simple, sublime intuition that the world, the playground of this story, is already built, and now all that's left to do is capture it in a way that feels the most appropriate to our identification with how the characters themselves see, move through, and occupy it, rather than stylization imposing a tyranny of forms upon the story from which the human drama can't escape and relate to us. It's not that DaCosta is ill-suited for this kind of job. It's that the screenplay by Garland is ill-suited to her. She is completely overqualified to be applying this much consideration to a project that, as it goes on, you realize that Garland's script is just excessively retreading not just locations, not just themes, but entire character arcs from the first movie. And doing so in such a way that all the worst just over-explains and belabors everything with that very cheap exploitation flick oratory dialogue, meaning so that by the end of it, there isn't even a small mouse hole that you can poke your eye into and find something that isn't just there to be explained to you, but something that you not only have to, but get to put together for yourself. Boyle and Garland kept all the best stuff for themselves and then basically pulled up stakes and left DaCosta to apply her best talents to an inherently compromised work. One that is quite frankly forced by association to make good on the elliptical framing of the first film with the character of Jimmy, but is so boring in how it develops that character while pushing a far more interesting child interlocutor to the sidelines that it not only makes you resent that Garland teased you for so little payoff in the first place, it significantly dampens my initial appraisal of 28 years later at least. But also basically making DaCosta's follow-up a ticking time bomb that I'm not really surprised bombed as hard as it did. DaCosta is doing her best in an unwinnable situation where the script she's adapting strips out all of the most interesting parts of the first film, adds only things that are highly derivative of other zombie and apocalyptic fantasy, and explains everything in such mind-numbing detail that gradually it starts to occur to you that the Bone Temple isn't just bombing in front of your eyes. It's literally falling apart like a jittery jalopy running down the road, with a certain climactic sequence in which Iron Maiden's The Number of the Beast is featured, but just butchered in editing because DaCosta and editor Jake Roberts can't find any fluid way of cutting it to the sequence they filmed, what little material Garland's script gives them to work with. I'm not surprised this thing choked on its own vomit and died. The few people not polarized away from the first 28 years later probably went away from the second one with the worst word-of-mouth negative reactions. Because it's not just a cheap, hacky retread of the first film, but it's a cheap, hacky retread that only looks cheaper and gets hackier the longer and longer it goes on. With the ever more annoying liberal centrist Garland even having the goddamned nerve to weave his agitprop into the ending, where a father played by Cillian Murphy is stressing the importance to his student child of how the Allied victors in World War II actually attempted to build up their defeated enemies rather than leave them totally disempowered and economically emasculated. Yeah, how did that go for you, Civil War boy? I didn't see you giving this pre-chewed gruel to someone like Ray Mendoza on Warfare. It seems like it's pretty easy for another light-skinned reactionary guy to get a foot up into the film industry with you just signing on as co-director and producer to get his back. Again, I'm not trying to patronize DaCosta. She's fine. We're fine. But with this last special Black Film History Month for the New Movie Diary, I'd say that this is a perfect microcosm of how implicit bias isn't just confined to one-on-one person-to-person interactions. How it's like there's some ephemeral phantom at work here that easily the most successful Black woman filmmaker of her generation who isn't a pop star, who has already done both a major Hollywood tentpole that most people seem to greet pretty warmly, and a prestige picture that I just know if more people see it, more people are going to be like, hold up, why is nobody still talking about this one? This is literally the definition of a breakthrough auteur film. Even then, you get a little too confident hanging out with these old white guys who I'm sure it's nice they gave you so much creative control, but like I said with a really old review of Robert Rodriguez's Hypnotic, I think there's a big difference between creative control and creative freedom. You end up making the cheapest movie of your career, and for your hard work trying to redeem this stuff, polishing off this turd in a way that plenty of white guy filmmakers have had to do themselves, but none so often at this stage in their comparable body of work with that diversity of subject and genre and scale. You also end up getting the worst bomb of your career and thus a way bigger hit to your professional reputation than any of those white guys are ever going to worry about unless they're like epic levels of men would rather make bad movies than go to therapy, like Josh Trank or Colin Trevorrow. It's not even so much about thinking DaCosta is never going to get a bite at a real juicy commercial project or prestige picture again, and properly. It's just the bitter knowledge that DaCosta could never take a shit as stinky as The Book of Henry. She could never have a freak out and firing as bad as Josh Trank. She could never get silently fired from directing a fucking Star Wars movie and the studio have Tony Gilroy come in to completely rewrite and reshoot half the fucking movie and still be able to have made HEDDA. HEDDA is the answer. HEDDA is the promise. Go watch HEDDA. It's fantastic. How am I, as a problematic, out-of-pocket white guy, going to take away some of the sting of having to give the most high-profile movie directed by a Black woman in the last year a negative review? How am I going to make it better when I'm ending Black Film History Month by giving The Bone Temple a tepid 2.5 out of 5? The Bone Temple? Pfft. More like the Bonehead Temple, am I right? Nah, that sucks. I got a better one for you. The Bone Temple? Isn't that what Joan Woodward told Paul Newman their bedroom was called? Anyway, the only thing that's going to make this any better is if I really fess up and realize 28 Years Later was probably among the most overrated movies of last year, including by me. The payoff to that Jimmy stuff falls apart, and so now it's not only this follow-up that sucks, it's that 28 Years Later is compromised to a permanent end. That sick-ass Young Fathers soundtrack and stressful as sound mix be damned. So if a filmmaker as good as DaCosta has got to eat a 2.5 out of 5 at the end of Black Film History Month, you bastards, I'm taking some shine off of 28 Years Later. See, now it's not even 3.5, now it's just a 3. How do you like that? Next time, ruin your own goddamn reputation. Don't try to launder it through someone who still has some originality to contribute. Fucking wankers. With that, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.